Welcome to the Living Loud and Proud podcast, brought to you by Disability Pride, Pennsylvania. If you need a link to the transcript for this episode, please visit our accessible website at www.disabilitypridepa.org/podcast. And now, here is your host.
Hey folks, welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of the Living Loud and Proud podcast. Today is the first episode in our Amplifying Independence series, all about the formation of social supports and laws that help disabled individuals to live independently. We're focusing specifically on the formation of the Social Security Administration and how policy has shaped the program over time. I'm your host and producer, Phill Rosen, today, and I'm joined once more by my co-producer, Ray DECA Horton. Ray, how's it going?
All right. How's everybody doing today?
Oh, that's great. Awesome. So, as always, if you're more interested in this topic, please do some research on your own. There's a lot to delve into here. We had to cut a bunch of information for time. And the politics behind all of the decisions that went into this are actually really fascinating if you're interested in that. We would love to continue this conversation online, so please comment, share, and like this episode if you enjoy our show. All right, let's get into it.
Okay. So, all right. So where should you begin? You know what? At the very beginning, the initial original proposals for Social Security programs nationwide. We're talking about, the early 1900s, specifically when?
So 1932 is the first, mention in any place in America of creating a monthly stipend for the elderly. It was first proposed by Dudley J. Leblanc during his 1932 campaign for governor of Louisiana. He did lose the election. But some other political operatives within Louisiana, specifically Huey Long, whose nickname was the Kingfish.
Okay.
They saw the popularity of this and they decided, hey, why don't we take this federal?
Get some votes.
Exactly. And Huey Long is specifically notable because he adopted the idea in his national platform, attacking the original New Deal from FDR for not being radical enough. And this is important because he was planning a primary bid for president against FDR in 1936.
For those who don't know the initials.
Yes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he was assassinated, though, the year prior, 1935, by Carl Weiss at the Louisiana State Capitol. So he was unfortunately not able to run for president.
That sucks.
I mean, for him, sure.
Yeah.
But Francis Townsend popularized this idea, LeBlanc's idea, in 1933 more nationally.
Okay.
And the influence of his Townsend plan persisted into the 1950s.
Okay.
So a lot of the discussion through the Townsend plan had to do with the early debates centering how the measure would be funded, how Social Security as a fund would get the revenue to be able to then disperse payments out to average citizens. So some argued for individuals to pay into the system over the course of their career. Of course, critics to this, the obvious is, but what about people who are already working? They're not going to have enough time to accrue anything of any real value here.
Okay.
So adequate benefits down the line would not be a thing for people who were currently working at the time. And in 1934, there was a group of political sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that developed the proposal for a federally funded pension plan, similar to what Social Security became.
Okay.
And these men were all generally economic advisors in one capacity or another for FDR.
Mm-hmm.
So like Edwin Witte, for instance, was the executive director of the President's Committee on Economic Security under FDR. He's often credited as being the father of Social Security. He disputed that himself, though. He actually thought that it would be more appropriate to refer to a colleague of his, Arthur J. Altmeyer, who became the Assistant Secretary of Labor under Francis Perkins during FDR's term.
Okay.
And Wilbur Cohen as well worked on this proposal with his two colleagues from UW-Madison.
Huh. All righty.
And of course, as with anything, there's opposition, right? I mean, political stuff, there's always going to be some controversy.
Right.
But Social Security was quite controversial because some argued it would reduce the labor force. At the time, remember, this is the early 1930s, right? What was happening in the 1930s?
Which thing in particular? I mean, we had World War One. I mean, not World War One. Everything that was, leading up to World War II, the Depression.
Right, the Great Depression. What was a big hallmark of the Great Depression? What was a big problem within the Great Depression? Do you remember this, Ray? Well, no money, but why was there no money? Because younger men were unable to get into the workforce because older men were having to stay longer to work, and there were less jobs available due to automation and the factory line, along with some other economic things that I'm not going to go into. There's a lot more that went into the Great Depression and how it all played out than what I just said. That was a gross oversimplification, but the more older workers that were able to retire comfortably and safely, the better the outlook was going to be for younger men to be able to start accumulating wealth.
Right.
And to get us out of the Depression. Right.
So
that's what a lot of the supporters for the Social Security plan argued. Another big set of arguments against Social Security, and this just shows how this country has been thought of, or has thought of capitalism versus socialism. It's always been this kind of existential threat for forever. So Senator Thomas Gore, who was a Democrat from Oklahoma, asked the Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins,
who, by the way, was the very first female to ever serve in the presidential cabinet.
Yep. Big deal there. But he asked her, isn't this socialism? She responded with, well, not really. I mean, he continued, though, down this line of, questioning. And he said, isn't this a teeny weeny bit of socialism?
Wow. Okay.
Essentially trying to get this weird association. It's like the ACA and Obamacare, right?
Right.
Where, people are fine with the ACA, but they hate Obamacare. Well, it's because of branding.
Yeah, exactly.
Another issue with the original proposal of Social Security, was that most women were excluded from the benefits of unemployment insurance and old age pensions, and a lot of blacks as well in America were, especially in the South, but everywhere it was an issue. So there were a lot of really broad categories of workers that weren't covered, like I said. Agricultural labor, domestic service, maids, servants, that kind of stuff. Government employees. Most teachers were excluded because, well, they're technically government employees in a way.
Right.
A lot of nurses.
That probably weren't. Oh, right. Nurses.
hospital employees, librarians, public workers again, social workers, and people who did not work full time, so intermittent workers. Sharecroppers and the like would be a pretty famous example of that.
So basically, everybody that really definitely would have needed it, they did not want it to be covering.
Well, story of America, right? In a way. I just said the quiet part out loud. I'm sorry. But anyways, it was mostly women and minorities. The numbers really break down as like 90% of domestic labor in the year 1940 were women. Like those employees were women.
Right.
2/3 of all employed Black women were in domestic service. So, huge number of people just being completely cut out. And
these were the people who basically, we're talking about the 1940s. Yeah. I mean, come on. I mean, never had there been so many factory workers, that were women, because all the men were off to war, and definitely all the minorities, Wow. Okay, go on.
Yeah. And I mean, this is just like right around the time that America would be thinking about getting into the war at the time, I believe. Pearl Harbor was what, like 1939, 1940?
What was it, 41?
Or maybe 41. So we had ramped up the factory anyways because we needed to be sending things overseas to our allies, but we hadn't, necessarily been full-throatedly in the war, so to speak. Right. But anyways, another thing that's important number-wise to think about is nearly half the working population was excluded from the original proposal.
Right.
So, like I was saying, nearly 2/3 of all African Americans in the labor force and 70 to 80% in some parts of the South. Not really surprising, given the history of our country. And, this was still before the civil rights movement really took hold and got the wins that they really needed to change this. And the NAACP actually protested the Social Security Act when it was proposed. And they described it as a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of Negroes to fall through.
Yeah.
That is a direct quote from, their arguments against it. And some of this may be pointing to the fact that there were a lot of Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, quote unquote, that were in positions of power on the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee at the time. And those were like the two major committees debating the bill before it went to a vote on the floor. This has been disputed in the historical texts, but given how the last half of the 20th century was with regards to how politics worked, I'm willing to gather that there may have been more than a few people that were not explicitly doing this because of racism, but racism motivated at least some of it. So I think there's probably a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B here. My personal opinion. Disability Pride does not necessarily endorse my opinion. Just put that out there. But
got it.
That's where I'm coming from. And, Edwin Witte himself questioned whether the Social Security Act of 1935 would even pass. It was so controversial.
Right.
Part of it was just simply due to the fact that it was super similar to another piece of New Deal legislation, which was the Railroad Retirement Act. And that act got struck down by the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
As the name suggests, very similar to the initial Social Security program that was proposed.
Right.
don't have time to get into the details, but constitutionality of the Social Security Act was affirmed by two different cases: the Stewart Machine Company v. Davis and Helvering v. Davis. Both of these were test cases essentially to see whether Social Security could even go through. They were, and that's really the main importance of it, was just to affirm the Social Security Act as being something that's constitutional.
Okay.
At least in terms of the broader context of history.
Okay.
If you do want to learn more, by all means, there's a lot of information about this everywhere online, and a lot of it is really fascinating to read, but just don't have the time to talk about it here. And now I kind of want to talk about like the implementation of the act after being passed in August of 1935.
Okay.
So the first reported Social Security payment was to Ernest Ackerman. He was a motorman from Cleveland who retired the day after Social Security began.
Okay. All right.
So the last pay period, he had 1 day's worth of tax taken out, and that was 5 cents.
Wow. Okay.
For the final pay period. He received a lump sum payment of 17 cents from Social Security the next month.
Wow. Okay. All right.
It was like January 31st, 1937, I believe, is when he received it.
Woo, we got to figure out how to make this work better. Okay. So going forward.
Yeah, and the first monthly payment was issued on January 31st of 1940 to Ida Mae Fuller of Ludlow, Vermont.
Uh-huh.
In 1937, 38, and 39, the first 3 years Social Security was on the books, she paid a total of $24.75 into the Social Security system. Okay. So that was the amount taken out of her paychecks in taxes. Her first check was for a grand total of $22.54, right. Meaning that by the second month she collected, by February, she had already exceeded her total amount paid into the system.
Okay.
In terms of what she received. And ultimately, she collected a grand total of $22,888.92 by the time of her death in 1975 at the age of 100.
Ah, okay.
And I think I saw that she was a few weeks shy of turning 101. So okay. She had a very long life, surprisingly long life, considering, the statistics of the average American at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
And why they chose the age of 65 as being the retirement age at the time. So,
like 1975 is when she passed away at 100. Yeah, no, that she was. Yeah, that was a mortality status. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so, what were the effects of like Social Security over time? I mean, it's one of these things like, oh yeah, everyone gets a certain amount paid out every month, but right. what are the real effects of doing that? Like, why is that important? Well, in 1950, as many as 40% of Americans over the age of 65 were employed in some capacity, meaning they did not have enough retirement savings to be able to fully retire at the age of 65.
Right.
Like maybe they retire from their career, but then they get a job at like, say, a Walmart as like a greeter or something like that.
Exactly.
By 1980, the figure had dropped to less than 20%, culminating in an all-time low of 11% by 1990. So this dropped the number of people who were unable, due to a lack of savings or a lack of planning, to be able to retire and have at least some time to just rest after they worked. Huge deal. Another big thing that was a massive deal is that people over the age of 65 had the highest poverty rate of any age group in the US in the 1950s. And the largest percentage of the nation's wealth was concentrated in the hands of Americans under the age of 35.
Okay.
Now, in my life, that has never been the case. But by 2010, this was reversed, with the largest percentage of wealth being in the hands of Americans aged 55 to 75, and those under 45 being among the poorest. And this means that elder poverty, which was once an extremely common sight here in America, was almost entirely eliminated. I think the percentage is less than 10% now.
Okay.
So Social Security as a program has overperformed, I think, based on what it was intended to do, which was to provide people with the ability to retire and get more people who are younger into the workforce and advancing faster.
Right.
All right. So now I kind of want to just talk about some of the amendments in the 1950s and 60s. There have been a number of changes over the years to Social Security, and this has happened in every decade. But for the purposes of our interests, the 1950s and 60s are really the most interesting to me. And I think that'll become apparent as we go through them. So in 1950, household employees working at least 2 days a week for the same person were added to Social Security. So people who were maids working for one person or some sort of indentured servant were added to the Social Security scheme. Massive deal. Hotel workers, laundry workers, all agricultural workers, and state and local government employees were added in 1954. The tax rate that was taken out of people's paychecks for FICA taxes was increased to 4%, split 2% between the employer and 2% the employee. Mm-hmm. And disability benefits were also added in the same year. Women were allowed to retire at the age of 62 with benefits reduced by 25%, and widows of covered workers were allowed to retire at 62 without a reduction in benefits, also in 1956.
Okay.
Retirement at the age of 62 was extended to men, and the tax rate increased to 6%, so 3 and 3, employer-employee. 1962 also recognized the increased role of women in the workplace, allowing dependent husbands, widowers, and children to collect benefits. And the Social Security Act of 1965 added Medicare and Medicaid as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society program. In 1965, also, the age at which widows could begin collecting benefits was reduced to 60. Widowers were not included in this change. When divorce became the major cause of marriages ending, divorcees were added to the list of recipients.
Okay.
Now, this was pretty strict. You had to be over the age of 65, married for at least 20 years, and prove dependency on ex-husband.
Right. Yeah.
To collect benefits. So it was pretty limited, but this was a major step forward given how much no-fault divorce was increasing at the time.
Exactly. I was getting ready to say, also, this was a reflection of the times, too. How you were expected to be. Yeah. I mean, anyway, another time, another podcast.
Right. Well, exactly. And something that has been kind of an issue for Social Security over time, and I decided to include it into this list, is in 1968, there was a unified budget that was adopted. Which means that the entire sum of all government activity was a single measure of the fiscal status. So what this means practically is that the national debt is offset by using the surplus in programs like Social Security trust funds and there's all sorts of different trust funds throughout the government
Uh-huh.
that make the debt appear much smaller than it otherwise would, because essentially what they're doing is they're increasing the credit worthiness of the country against the debt by taking these programs and saying, oh, we have a trust fund here. This is a line item budget that actually puts us in the green or in the black, right?
Uh-huh.
It's fudgy accounting. There are some equivalencies for, household incomes, right? Or household budgets. But this has allowed them to kind of hollow out Social Security over time from the inside. Because you have the trust fund there, it's going to hollow it out over time, regardless. This allowed Congress to spend money without raising taxes too, which, as we all know, is political suicide in this country. Probably everywhere, but it's especially a problem here in this country. So I do want to kind of go back, though, to 1956 and start talking a little bit more about disability benefits.
Okay.
Because, we are Disability Pride, Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
It's a little more interesting to talk about things that affect disabled people for us. So let's talk about Social Security disability insurance.
And you're saying this all started in 1956?
It was officially, formally passed and added into Social Security, yes.
Okay.
It is shortened to SSDI, and that is how I will be referring to it almost exclusively from here on out, because it's just too long to say all four words. But it provides benefits to people who have a medically determinable disability restricting their employment opportunities. So what does that mean? Well, they only pay full benefits, and only in cases in which the disability is expected to last at least 1 year or result in death. So it has to be so significant that you're not going to recover quickly.
Right.
It is distinct from supplemental security income, which is kind of your regular Social Security payments that like retired people take. But it's distinct from supplemental security income in that they are not based on prior contribution credits earned through work.
Okay.
So if you are a disabled individual, you can apply for SSDI at any point in your life, and you will receive based on what you were making, but it will not be counted against how much you paid into the system.
Right.
At the end of 2020, 9.7 million Americans received benefits from the SSDI program. And I can actually break this down for you into like who exactly made up the demographics. So 8.2 million disabled workers, 1.4 million children of disabled workers, and 100,000 spouses of disabled workers.
Okay.
Roughly received benefits in 2020. Children and spouses are sometimes referred to as auxiliary beneficiaries due to the fact that they receive benefits based on their relationship to a disabled individual, but not because they themselves are disabled either physically or mentally.
Right.
The number of disabled workers on the rolls peaked in 2014 at 9 million. And beneficiaries grew rapidly between 1990 and 2010 before leveling off and declining in recent years. Now, there's kind of two schools of thought. There's a more conservative school of thought and a more progressive school of thought. So what were those thoughts? Well, according to David Autor and Mark Dugan, policy changes and earnings patterns were responsible for growth. Well, what does that mean? So an SSDI Reform Act loosened the disability screening process, leading to more SSDI awards and shifting towards claimants with, quote, low mortality disorders. Not sure what that fully means, but they defined it as back pain and mental illness.
Okay.
Which, I don't know. I'm fairly young. I haven't had too much issues with back pain, but when I do have it, I don't understand how anyone minimizes it. It's terrible. So, I don't know. But anyways, SSDI benefits Rosen value relative to what recipients would have earned from employment, prompting greater numbers of individuals to seek benefits, according to Autor and Dugan. There may be something to some of the arguments here. It does kind of, based on my reading, feel like they are blaming a symptom and not the cause.
Right.
As much. But, you know, what do I know? I'm not an economist by any means. Another school of thought regarding this trend emphasizes the demographic factors. So what are we talking about? So population growth is a big factor here. I mean, in 1990, what was the population of the U.S.? What do you think, Ray?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, definitely, a couple 100 million, few 100 million.
Yeah. Okay. So the actual number was 250.1 million people.
Okay.
By 2020, do you know how much it grew?
So probably another 100 million.
You're not that far off. It's a little less than what you said, but it was 331.5 million. So that's 80 million people, basically.
Yeah, a lot of babies are going on. Anyway, but yeah.
So that's a big factor right there. I mean, when you have a larger population, of course, there's going to be a larger proportion of people, or larger number, not proportion, larger number of people who are going to need to have access to certain things like Social Security disability benefits.
Yeah.
Another thing that's a big factor here is the aging of baby boomers.
Yeah.
They get to a certain age, and most people experience some form of a disability in old age.
Right.
As to whether, you start having the disability, say, in your late 40s, early 50s, or, you're lucky and it bypasses you until your 70s or 80s, doesn't really make much of a difference. I will say, for the purposes of the program, they only have people under the age of 65 on the disability insurance. But, the fact of the matter is that a lot of baby boomers did not always take the best care of themselves when they were youngins.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
And so a lot of baby boomers have the complications that come along with that kind of lifestyle, where you don't really take care of yourself for the first couple of decades of your adult life. And suddenly you have issues with heart disease and diabetes and, whatever other condition they may have, or, cancer risk shoots through the roof.
Yeah, exactly. The environment.
Right. So my feeling here is yes, the aging of the baby boom population may have been a factor here, but there also is the secondary fact that a lot of baby boomers didn't necessarily feel like they needed to take care of themselves at as early an age as some other generations did, as well as, here in America, we especially don't feel like we need to work on things sometimes, when in other places there might be more emphasis on, I don't know, moving around or eating healthier or whatever things.
Better working conditions.
Well, better working conditions too. You're totally right about all of that.
Yeah.
Also, access to mental health care is a major factor here too, but we're not going to get into
Right.
more of those kinds of details right now. Another big factor is the growth in women's labor force participation. So, women in the labor force, in 1990, it was 57.5% of women were working in some capacity. This proportion peaked in 1999 at 60%. And in 2023, which is the most recent year that I could get data from,
Mm-hmm.
it was 57.3% of women who are working. So at the end of the day, when you think about it, like, the 40s and 50s, I mean, outside of the war effort, the women's participation in the labor force was much smaller as a proportion.
Yeah, they all were supposed to be June Cleaver after the war.
Right, exactly. There's a lot of reasons why that changed over time that we're not going to get into, but certainly the cost of goods and cost of living going up certainly has gotten to the point where
Civil rights climate.
Yeah.
Women's lib. Yeah. Yeah. Another podcast for another time.
Exactly. And then there also was an increase in the full retirement age for Social Security. I believe it was 10 or 15 years ago. I remember this being debated when I was in college, if I remember correctly. Okay. So it got raised from 65 to 66, which 1 year doesn't seem like much of a difference, but apparently that saved billions of dollars over 10 years. So I don't know how the math works here, but that's what I heard.
Okay.
Something else that's kind of important here to think about in terms of the context of Social Security disability insurance is that recipients of SSDI tend to have high levels of poverty relative to other Social Security beneficiaries.
Right.
Approximately 24% of disabled workers have a family income below the official poverty level in the U.S., compared to only 7.1% of retired workers.
Okay.
Approximately 38% of SSDI beneficiaries experience material hardship, things like low or no food security, an inability to pay bills or housing costs, or, to even have things that, I consider them utilities, but they're technically not, things like internet in your home.
Right.
Or buying a cell phone or having a cell phone plan that could be burdensome for a lot of people who are on SSDI. Approximately 72% of SSDI recipients are between the age of 50 and 66. So that suggests that a large proportion of people who are on SSDI become disabled later in life in some fashion. And 24% of all SSDI recipients are Black.
Okay.
Many recipients do receive Medicaid due to their low income level.
Right.
And the average monthly benefit paid to disabled workers was about $1,260 in 2019. Approximately 36% receive a monthly benefit under $1,000, which wild to me.
Yeah.
The amount is dependent upon your previous earnings prior to becoming eligible for SSDI. And primary insurance amount is what gets paid out to people. And this is a formula that's computed, including workers' past earnings, wage growth in the economy prior to the disability onset, and a benefit formula that weights lower earners greater than higher earners. Okay. So it is progressive in how this gets calculated. The amount that each disabled individual receives is equal to 100% of the PIA. Eligible spouse or child, an eligible spouse or children of the disabled worker can receive 50% of the PIA as a benefit amount, but total payments to a family are subject to a maximum.
Okay.
As with any social programs. These also replace a larger share of past earnings for low earners and increase with price inflation upon an individual's enrollment in benefits.
Got it. Yeah. Which that didn't seem to happen too much in those earlier years.
Right. Well, cost of living adjustments for Social Security were often stagnant for a long time.
Right.
Like you said.
Yeah.
I believe it wasn't until the 70s that there were some pretty radical changes made to that part of Social Security.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so that's about it, I guess.
That's about all I really felt like I could research, but I think this is an important topic to really discuss because I think it helps to kind of contextualize why, having independence can be difficult for a lot of disabled individuals, because we essentially force a lot of disabled individuals to live in poverty just to be by themselves or independent.
Right.
And get the services that they really need to survive, which unfortunate.
Yeah. Okay. It's really crazy because I never really thought about how young it is, the Social Security program. It wasn't even thought about until the 30s. I mean, you never think about this stuff, so this has been fascinating, learning the history of it, and the evolution of it too. And looking at the, periods in time during, that last century as it was evolving, developing, and the things that it went through. I guess this brings us to a close.
Yeah. So, thanks everyone for watching or listening. Watching, what am I, on TV?
Well, they're looking at the graphic that's on the screen, right?
Yeah. Anyways, thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed our show, please like, comment, share. We'd love to continue this conversation online and talk more about anything that you want to talk about regarding this. Ray, do you have anything else you want to talk about?
I have nothing else.
All right. Well, everyone, until the next time we release, have a good time.
Bye-bye. Please visit our accessible website at www.disabilitypridepa.org. You can find us on social media at DisabilityPridePA on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.